The civilian government of Iran no longer runs Iran. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of breathless headline designed to get you to click and then deliver nothing. Stay with me, because what happened inside Tehran over the last 60 days is not a headline. It is a structural collapse of political authority, playing out in slow motion, and the consequences are already being felt at gas stations in Ohio, grocery aisles in Dubai, and central bank meetings in Frankfurt. This is not a story about war, not really. It is a story about what happens when the people who fight a war decide they no longer need the people who were supposed to end it. This is Iron Dispatch. I'm glad you're here. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time, because this story is moving faster than almost anyone in mainstream media is tracking. Let's go back to March 1st, 2026. On that day, Mohammad Vahidi was appointed Supreme Commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. The timing was not coincidental. The appointment came as Iranian and American forces were locked in their most intense confrontation since the revolution of 1979. 2 months of strikes, naval engagements, proxy battles, and Hormuz Strait brinkmanship had pushed both countries to the edge of something neither wanted to officially name. The civilian government, led by figures still nominally committed to a negotiated exit, was working, quietly, carefully, toward a path out. Vahidi's appointment slammed that door. Here is what you need to know about Vahidi that most coverage omits entirely. He is not a bureaucrat in a general's uniform. He is the man Argentine prosecutors named in connection with the 1994 AMIA bombing in Buenos Aires, a truck bomb that killed 85 people in a Jewish community center and remains the deadliest terrorist attack in the history of the Western Hemisphere. He has spent decades at the operational center of the IRGC's most aggressive external activities, putting him in command of Iran's most powerful military force. At the exact moment Iran needed someone to step back from the edge, was not a miscalculation. It was a declaration that the IRGC was done letting civilians decide what came next. 4 days earlier, on March 4th, the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed. Brent crude crossed $120 per barrel that same day. Within a week, combined oil production from Gulf Cooperation Council states had dropped to 6.7 million barrels per day. By March 12th, that figure had collapsed further, at least 10 million barrels per day offline. That is approximately 10% of the entire global oil supply, erased in less than 2 weeks. The ripple effects were not subtle. By the end of March, the average American was paying $4 per gallon at the pump, a 30% increase driven almost entirely by events in a narrow strip of water 7,000 miles away. The European Central Bank, which had been positioning itself for a rate cut in early 2026, reversed course entirely. On March 19th, Frankfurt announced it was postponing that cut, revising its inflation forecast upward and slashing its growth projections for the year. The IMF, meanwhile, had already published its numbers. Iran's economy was projected to contract by 6.1% in 2026. Inflation was forecast at 68.9%. The Iranian rial, already devastated by years of sanctions, had reached 1.32 million rials to the dollar. And that was before the second wave of the war. In just 12 days of active conflict, the rial lost 60% of its remaining value. Trump said it plainly, in the way that Trump tends to make plain statements that analysts then spend weeks debating. Iran is losing $500 million a day. Treasury Secretary Bessent was more clinical. He noted that the storage facilities at Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, were filling rapidly. Within days, he said, the tanks would be full, and Iran would have no choice but to shut down its own wells. When you can't export and you can't store, you stop pumping. When you stop pumping, you stop earning. When you stop earning, with $35 billion in total foreign exchange reserves and 92 million people to feed, you enter a different kind of war entirely. But here's what nobody is talking about: the number that actually explains why the IRGC decided to act when it did. Somewhere in the Asia-Pacific region, sitting in tankers and offshore storage facilities, there are approximately 180 million barrels of Iranian oil. Pre-sold, pre-positioned, waiting. That stockpile represents 2 to 3 months of additional economic runway, a buffer that exists outside the reach of American-imposed blockades and beyond the visibility of most Western intelligence assessments. The IRGC knew this number. The civilian government knew this number. The difference is in how each side interpreted it. The civilian government saw a shrinking window for negotiation. a reason to move quickly toward a ceasefire before the buffer ran dry. The IRGC saw a strategic cushion, 2 to 3 months in which to complete objectives that a negotiated peace would permanently foreclose. So when diplomats began moving, Turkey convened 21 hours of talks in Islamabad on April 11th. Pakistan played the mediator, trying to bridge the gap between what Tehran's official negotiators could offer and what Washington would accept. The session ran through the night. A joint counterproposal was being drafted. And then, nothing. The session expired. The proposal was never submitted. The deadline came and went without a document. 3 days later, on April 22nd, Donald Trump extended the ceasefire. Not because negotiations had succeeded, but because Pakistan's Prime Minister and Army Chief Asim Munir personally requested it. A temporary pause, a held breath, not a resolution. The resolution, it turned out, was coming from a different direction entirely. On April 23rd, Mohammad Bagher Galibaf resigned from Iran's negotiating team. The official version was quiet. The version that circulated through diplomatic channels was not. Galibaf had not resigned, he had been pushed. IRGC pressure, sources indicated, had forced him out. Consider who Galibaf is. He has served as Speaker of Iran's parliament since 2020. Before that, he commanded the Basij Imam Reza Brigade, the 5th Nasser Division, led the IRGC's construction conglomerate Khatam al-Anbiya, served as mayor of Tehran, and ran for president 4 times. He is not an outsider. He is not a reformist. He is a man with deeper IRGC roots than almost anyone in the civilian structure. And even he was too moderate. Even he was too willing to negotiate. Even he had to go. In his place, the name now circulating at the center of Iran's political power is Saeed Jalili. If you followed Iranian nuclear diplomacy between 2007 and 2013, you know exactly what that name means. Jalili served as Iran's chief nuclear negotiator during those 6 years, and those 6 years produced nothing. Not because the international community refused to engage, but because Jalili's approach to negotiation was, functionally, to not negotiate, to delay, to reframe, to insist on preconditions that he knew could not be met. Every analyst who dealt with him during that period arrived at the same conclusion. Jalili was not a negotiator. He was a stalling mechanism with a title. The IRGC replacing Galibaf with Jalili is not a personnel change. It is a strategic statement. The message is, there will be no deal. Not now. Not under these terms. Possibly not under any terms the current American administration would accept. And here is the part that should unsettle you, regardless of where you stand on this conflict. Iran's leadership, or rather the IRGC that now constitutes Iran's effective leadership, has calculated that the cost of continuing is survivable. The civilian population is suffering catastrophically. Vitol CEO Russell Hardy, speaking on April 21st, estimated total production losses from the conflict at somewhere between 600 and 700 million barrels, with projections heading toward 1 billion. That is not an abstraction. That is food, medicine, electricity, employment, all of it priced in oil that is not flowing. The GCC countries that import more than 80% of their food through the Strait of Hormuz had already seen 70% of their regional food imports disrupted by mid-March. Retailers like Lulu were airlifting basic goods, airlifting groceries. In 2026, the IRGC does not experience that suffering the way 92 million ordinary Iranians experience it. The IRGC has its own supply chains, its own revenue streams, its own construction empire, its own black market infrastructure built over 4 decades of sanctions. When Iran bleeds, the IRGC bleeds last. That asymmetry is the engine of everything you are watching unfold. When a military force inside a country controls enough of the economy to survive what would kill everyone else, and when that force has just removed the last senior official willing to negotiate an exit, you are no longer watching a government managing a crisis. You are watching a Praetorian capture. The civilian structures remain. The parliament still meets. The titles still exist. But the decision-making has moved. It has moved to men in uniforms, men with operational experience in places like Buenos Aires in 1994 and Hormuz in 2026. Men who have decided that the acceptable cost of holding power is a number they are willing to pay, even if the population is not. The ceasefire, as of April 22nd, is still technically holding. American and Iranian forces are observing a pause that began on April 7th, 2 weeks of quiet after approximately 2 months of intense confrontation. But a ceasefire without a negotiating framework is not peace. It is a loading screen. It is the moment between rounds when both sides assess damage and reposition. And Iran is repositioning around a leadership structure that, for the first time in the Islamic Republic's history, has dispensed with the pretense of civilian control. What comes next depends on a variable that no intelligence agency can fully model. How long the IRGC believes the 180 million barrel buffer will hold against the pressure being applied. How long the Pakistani mediation channel remains viable now that Galibaf, who had real institutional relationships, has been removed. And how long Washington is willing to maintain a ceasefire that the Iranian side is using not for diplomacy, but for consolidation. Because that is what is happening on the Iranian side of this pause. Not negotiation, consolidation. The removal of moderates, the installation of hardliners, the tightening of control over the one institution, the military, that actually matters when everything else is collapsing. The global economy is watching a country of 92 million people being steered by a force that answers to no electorate, no parliament, no judiciary that it doesn't already control. And that force has just signaled, through a series of personnel decisions and a diplomatic walkout, that it intends to keep steering. Oil markets understand this, even when political analysts are still hedging. The price of crude did not fall after the April 7th ceasefire the way markets typically respond to a pause in conflict. It stayed elevated. Because traders, whatever their other failings, are very good at reading the difference between a ceasefire and a settlement. And this is a ceasefire. The next move belongs to Tehran. But Tehran right now is not a government. It is a command structure. And command structures do not offer concessions. They offer terms. Watch what happens when the buffer runs out. Watch what happens when the storage tanks at Karg Island reach capacity, and the wells go silent, and the $500 million per day becomes $0. Not because of American pressure, but because Iran has physically nowhere left to put the oil it cannot sell. Watch what Jalili says, or more importantly, what he does not say. Because the silence of a man who spent 6 years not negotiating is not ambiguity, it is strategy. And the strategy, from where we are standing today, does not end at a table in Islamabad or a phone call brokered by Pakistan's army chief. It ends somewhere else, somewhere we cannot yet fully see. And that is the part of this story that is still in motion.